Welcome to A Cloud of Witnesses, a series on the history of the Christian faith. In this video, we'll continue to look at significant events and movements in the church in the modern period. We're going to focus on liberation theology and the evangelical left, and then look at the moral majority and the Christian right in the United States. We'll then continue examining the megachurch and the church growth movement, and conclude with looking at changes in worship practices and places. Liberation theology was a belief that a restructuring of society was part of the gospel message. It was formulated by many Catholic leaders and theologians in Latin America, where there was an emphasis on justice for the poor and the oppressed. The movement was initiated by French-born Catholic theologian Paul Gauthier following his influential book, Christ, the Church and the Poor, which was published in 1963. A few years later, in 1968, a conference was held in Medellin, Colombia, where important liberation resolutions were passed. Then a few years later, in 1968, a conference was held in Medellin, Colombia, where important liberation resolutions were passed. Then in 1971, Gustavo Gutierrez from Peru published A Theology of Liberation, History, Politics, Salvation. He was influenced by Gauthier and Marxist ideology, and he argued that Christian poverty was an act of loving solidarity with the poor, as well as a protest against poverty. According to Gutierrez, true liberation had three main dimensions. First, it consisted of political and social liberation, the elimination of the immediate causes of poverty and injustice. Secondly, it involved the emancipation of the poor, the marginalised, the downtrodden and the oppressed from all those, quote, things that limit their capacity to develop themselves freely and in dignity. Finally, it was liberation from selfishness and sin, and a re-establishment of a relationship with God and with others. Salvation was seen as a struggle against misery and exploitation, and involved all men and the whole man, he said. His publication influenced the Catholic worker movement and the French Christian youth worker organisation. Other Catholics who were influenced by liberation theology included Leonardo Boff from Brazil, Juan Leo Segundo from Uruguay, Helder Camara from Brazil, and Jean-Bertrand Aristide from Haiti. Dom Helder Camara was for a time the Catholic Archbishop of Brazil. He was an outspoken supporter of liberation theology in the 1970s and 80s. He commented, "When I give food to the poor, they call me a saint. When I ask why the poor have no food, they call me a communist." One of the most influential political leaders that was influenced by liberation theology was the Haitian-born Jean-Bertrand Aristide. He became a priest and he worked among the slum dwellers of Port-au-Prince, but motivated by liberation ideals, he became an active critic of the repressive dictatorship of Jean-Claude Duvalier, and he advocated the rights of the poor in Haiti. He organised and led a number of movements which protested against the Duvalier government. Then in 1968, Duvalier fled the country. Aristide continued to be the main spokesperson for liberation ideals and was eventually accused of inciting violence and was expelled from his Catholic order. In 1990, he announced his intention to run for the presidency and was elected. He served in this capacity for 3 times in total, but finally in the year 2004, He was ousted in a coup and fled to South Africa, where he lived until 2011. Despite opposition from the US government, he was permitted to return eventually to Haiti. What about its influence on the wider Catholic Church? Well, the movement was often described as a form of Christian socialism, and while it did enjoy widespread influence in Latin America, and particularly among the Jesuits, overall, its influence within Catholicism has diminished over recent times. Most elements of liberation theology were rejected by the Vatican, and liberation theologians were harshly admonished by Pope John Paul II and then subsequently by Pope Benedict XVI. And this opposition assisted in the slowing of its growth. Pope Francis was far more sympathetic to the ideas of liberation theology than his predecessor. While he had rejected links with Marxism and political revolution, Francis reaffirmed the Church's connection with the poor. In 2007, he'd authored an important document for a bishops' conference in Brazil, which continued this emphasis. It said, "We pledge to work harder so that our Latin American and Caribbean Church may continue to accompany our poorest brothers on their journey, even to martyrdom." While liberation theology has tended to be identified as a movement within the Catholic Church, there have been some notable exceptions, such as Jose Miguel Bonino, who was the Methodist from Argentina, and Ruben Alves, a Presbyterian from Brazil. While Bonino criticised the social gospel for its theological weakness and its utopian idealism, he maintained that liberation theology was the response of a generation of young Catholics and evangelicals to the call of the Holy Spirit for a renewed spiritual, ethical, and social commitment to the poor, the call for a new and integral evangelization. There was also an evangelical response to liberation theology. One of the influential figures was Ronald Sider, and by focusing on what the Bible said about the poor and the oppressed, in 1977 he wrote Rich Christians in an Age of Hunger. This was hailed by Christianity Today as one of the 100 most influential books in religion of the 20th century. His book had a strong emphasis on a biblical view of poverty. Sider focused on what the prophets such as Amos had said about justice and material gain without generosity. But he also examined the Old Testament teaching on such topics as the Sabbath years and the Jubilee years. With the Sabbath years, every 7 years the land was to be left uncultivated as a period of rest for the land, and all debts were to be forgiven and Jewish slaves released. The Jubilee year was to take place every 50 years. There was to be the return of land to its original owners, symbolising a reset and a renewal for the Israelites. Fundamentally, it was essentially a redistribution of wealth, as it impacted the problem of inherited wealth. Part of his argument was that evangelicals had tended to overlook or downplay the many warnings about wealth in the New Testament. For example, passages such as James chapter 5, verses 1 to 5.
Now listen, you rich people. Weep and wail because of the misery that is coming on you. Your wealth has rotted, and moths have eaten your clothes. Your gold and silver are corroded. Their corrosion will testify against you and eat your flesh like fire. You've hoarded wealth in the last days. Look, the wages you failed to pay the workers who mowed your fields are crying out against you. The cries of the harvesters have reached the ears of the Lord Almighty. You have lived on earth in luxury and self-indulgence. You've fattened yourselves in the day of slaughter.
Sider's call was in particular for Western Christians to become more aware that relative to the rest of the world, they were very wealthy. He encouraged Christians to live more simply and to go beyond just giving a tithe. He also challenged Western governments to live up to their own commitment to give 0.7% of GNI to needy nations in order to relieve crippling third world debt. Sider later became Professor of Theology at the Palmer Theological Seminary in Pennsylvania, and he founded and became president of Evangelicals for Social Action, now called Christians for Social Action. In his seminal work, Rich Christians in an Age of Hunger, Ronald Sider said, "We've allowed the values of our affluent, materialistic society to shape our thinking and acting toward the poor. It is much easier in evangelical circles today to insist on an orthodox Christology than on the biblical teaching that God is on the side of the poor. We've allowed our theology to be shaped by the economic preferences of our materialistic contemporaries rather than by Scripture. And that is to fall into theological liberalism. We have not been nearly as orthodox as we have claimed." He also authored Good News, Good Works, in which he called the church to embrace what he called the whole gospel. He defined this as a combination of evangelism, social engagement, and spiritual formation. In another work, Completely Pro-Life, published in the mid-1980s, he called Protestant Christians to take a consistent stand opposing abortion, capital punishment, nuclear weapons, hunger, and other conditions that he defined as anti-life. Sider also argued that we have a responsibility as stewards to care for God's creation. He said that while we are free to use the resources of the earth for human purposes, our dominion must be the gentle care of a loving gardener, not the callous exploitation of a self-centered lord. He also said our use of non-human creation must be a thoughtful stewardship that honours the creation's dignity and worth in the eyes of the Creator. Despite his anti-abortion stance, Ronald Sider, like many other Christians from the left, has laid out what he perceives as the dangers of Donald Trump. Another Protestant evangelical who emphasised this so-called holistic mission was René Padilla. Padilla was a crucial leader at the Lausanne International Congress on World Evangelization held in 1974. He persuaded the Congress to recognise social action as a crucial element in the mission of the Church. His influence is seen in paragraph 5 of the Lausanne Covenant, which states, "The message of salvation also implies a message of judgment upon every form of alienation, oppression, and discrimination, and we should not be afraid to denounce evil and injustice wherever they exist." There have been others, though, who have taken Sider to task. For example, David Chilton in his book Productive Christians in an Age of Guilt Manipulators, written in 1981, and John A. Schneider, who wrote
Another was
The
John
Good
R.
of Affluence,
Schneider, who wrote
Seeking God in a
The
Culture
Good
of
of
Wealth,
Affluence,
written in 2002.
Seeking God in a Culture of Wealth.
Schneider had been influenced by
Schneider
Michael
had been
Novak's
influenced
Spirit
by
of
Michael
Democratic
Novak's
Capitalism,
Spirit
of Democratic Capitalism, which had been written in 1991. Schneider argued that the scriptures show that material affluence of a sort is absolutely essential to God's creative vision for all human beings amid the flourishing that he has in store for his entire creation. These texts about material abundance and blessing particularly the narratives of Eden and the Promised Land, are thus anything but incidental trappings to the Christian perspective on economic life that we are seeking. And on the other side, there are also critics of this right-wing view, for example, of Schneider. Julie Hanson-Rubio from Family Ethics Practices for Christians argued that Schneider's conclusion that rich Christians owe those mired in poverty only a, quote, spirit of compassion full of respect, said it falls short for true compassion. Gary North, once president of the Institute of Christian Economics, represented an alternative Christian eco-political view and was also critical of Sider. He argued for a more laissez-faire or hands-off approach when it came to Christians seeking economic structural change. He advocated a more libertarian view of politics, that is, one which minimises the role and interference of the state in political, economic and educational areas. He said, "The Bible does not allow the imposition of some sort of top-down bureaucratic tyranny in the name of Christ. The kingdom of God requires a bottom-up society. The bottom-up Christian society rests ultimately on the doctrine of self-government under God, with God's law as the publicly revealed standard of performance. It is the humanist view of society that promotes top-down bureaucratic power." However, as pointed out earlier, the dangers of libertarianism is that it lacks a biblical view of the inherent sinfulness of man. Such views as Gary North helps us understand the heat of the debate over healthcare reform over the last decades in America. Many Christians see socialism as akin to communism. North has views which are described as Christian Reconstructionism. This can be summarised by the comment, "I certainly believe in biblical theocracy." But how theocracy was to be implemented in practice? For North, it meant an Old Testament approach, for example, to capital punishment for crimes, and this included homosexuality, for example. He further believed that capital punishment should be carried out by the Old Testament method of stoning. Similar to, but not identical with Christian Reconstructionism, is Christian nationalism. Now, the views of Christian nationalism have been outlined in Stephen Wolfe's book, A Case for Christian Nationalism, which was printed in 2022. Now, without going into great detail, Christian nationalists actually disavow Christian Reconstructionists who wanted so-called biblical law. Christian nationalists don't want this in terms of the Old Testament punishments, but they do want an establishment that explicitly favours Christianity against other religions. According to Wolfe, Christian nationalism is a totality of national action consisting of civil laws and social customs conducted by a Christian nation as a Christian nation in order to procure for itself both earthly and heavenly good in Christ. Essentially, Christian nationalism and Christian Reconstructionism are the opposite to the idea of the separation of the church and state. Perhaps most concerningly, in his book on Christian nationalism, Wolfe includes a chapter that deals with the right to revolution. There were others who wanted to promote a more middle ground between Sider and Schneider. For example, Craig Blomberg in his book Neither Poverty Nor Riches, A Biblical Theology of Possessions. And of course, this was taken from Proverbs chapter 30, verses 8 and 9, which says, "Give me neither poverty nor riches. Feed me with the food that is needful for me." So what are some of the negatives of liberation theology? In particular, liberation became focused on political and economic liberation rather than evangelism and spiritual liberation. There was also the concern that Marxist ideology had supplanted a Christian basis for the movement. On the positives, liberation theology led to important developments and a reawakening that God was concerned for the whole world, both physically and spiritually, along with the emphasis that justice is a significant goal for all Christians. This led in turn to Christians being concerned for the environment as well. And many evangelical organisations began from this concern for the poor and the oppressed. For example, the Evangelical Alliance Relief Fund, today known as TIA, was formed in 1968. Today, there are many evangelicals who, while affirming the primary tenets of evangelical theology, support what are often considered left-wing political policies in the United States. They are generally opposed to capital punishment, they're supportive of gun control, have a more socialist view of government policy through advocating support for the poor, and who are pacifist in their approach to foreign policy. Some of the well-known figures from the Christian left have included Tony Campolo, Jimmy Carter, Ron Sider, who we've mentioned, Jim Wallace, and Philip Yancey. To understand the Christian left a little better, here are a couple of quotes from Gregory Boyd. In his work, The Myth of a Christian Nation, How the Quest for Political Power is Destroying the Church, he said, "I'm sorry to tell you that America is not the light of the world and the hope of the world." He also chastised the so-called hypocrisy and pettiness of evangelicals who dwell on sexual issues like homosexuality and abortion. He said that American evangelicalism is guilty of nationalistic and political idolatry. Then, of course, there were those from the other side of the political spectrum, those from the so-called Christian right. One of the more influential groups was the Moral Majority, which began in 1979. It was an organisation made up of conservative Christians who campaigned on issues they believed central to upholding the Christian conception of the moral law. Jerry Falwell was the organisation's public face throughout the 1980s. The organisation dissolved officially in 1989 but lived on in the Christian Coalition of America. This group was initiated by Pat Robertson. At its height, the movement claimed to have a membership of about 1.2 million. However, today it is not so influential as it was before. As mentioned, Pat Robertson has been a high-profile spokesperson for the movement through his media involvement, in particular through the 700 Club. He actually ran for the US presidency. Critics of Robertson have highlighted his support for the former President of Liberia, Charles Taylor, who was indicted for war crimes. Robertson failed to mention in his broadcasts his $8 million investment in an Iberian gold mine. He was also accused of using the movement, called Operation Blessing, as a front for his own financial gain. After making pleas in 1994 for cash donations to Operation Blessing, allegedly to support airlifts for refugees from Rwanda to Zaire, it was later found that these planes were transporting diamond mining equipment for the African Development Corporation. This was a venture that Robertson had himself established along with Zaire's then dictator, Mobutu Sese Seko. There have been many other criticisms of Robertson, accusing him of being both unethical and hypocritical. Among many of his controversial statements on his program, The 700 Club, have included supporting assassinating the then Venezuelan president, Hugo Chavez, and claiming that Israel's leaders Yitzhak Rabin's assassination and Ariel Sharon's stroke were God's retribution. I don't know about this doctrine of assassination, but if he thinks we're trying to assassinate him, I think that we really ought to go ahead and do it. It's a whole lot cheaper than starting a war, and I don't think any oil shipments will stop. And then in 2016, Robertson uncritically endorsed Donald Trump as president, while in contrast, years earlier, he'd been highly critical of Bill Clinton's infidelity. In 1971, Jerry Falwell Sr. co-founded the Liberty University in Virginia. Today it has about 13,000 residential and about 90,000 online students. In 2020, it was rocked by a sex scandal involving its president, Jerry Falwell Jr., and his wife, Becky. Jerry Falwell Jr. subsequently resigned his position at the university. There have been many other accusations made against Pat Robertson, accusing him of being unethical and inconsistent. Some of the key other figures of the evangelical right are Franklin Graham, who was the son of Billy Graham, John MacArthur, the pastor of Grace Community Church in California, and both have been ardent supporters of Donald Trump. And MacArthur, in his response to the COVID crisis, said there is no pandemic, and his church openly defied the health guidelines during the crisis. Here's a list of some of the important concerns of the Christian right. For example, they're very much against abortion, homosexuality, marriage breakups, violence and promiscuity in the media, pervasive secularism in public education. And they're strongly for a strong military. They support Israel, and many are pro-gun advocates, and of course, they support right-wing politics. For example, the Republican Party, and in particular, the MAGA movement. Since World War II, we've witnessed the rise of the so-called mega church, and along with this has come the church growth movement. Significant figures within this movement have been Donald Anderson McGavran, Robert Schuler, known for his Hour of Power television broadcasts from his Crystal Cathedral in Los Angeles, Bill Hybels from Willow Creek, Illinois, known for advocating a seeker-friendly approach to worship, Rick Warren from Saddleback in Los Angeles, known for his 40 Days of Purpose series, and Joel Osteen from Lakewood in Houston, Texas, who pastors the largest church in the US with a staff of over 350 and over 50,000 people attending regularly. Donald McGavran was the son of missionary parents and was born and lived in India. His experiences led him to devote himself to finding the answer as to why some churches grow while others did not. In particular, he tried to discover the reasons for the success, or otherwise, of evangelism. In 1954, he published How Peoples Become Christian, later called Bridges of God. In this work, he advocated a number of principles with regard to church growth, in particular with respect to mission in the Third World. He followed this up with Understanding Church Growth in 1970. McGavran became the founder of the School of World Missions at Fuller Theological College in California, and he was a professor there for 30 years. His ideas strongly influenced both the direction of Protestant mission and approaches to evangelism by the church in the West. And many have applied his principles to the American church, seeking to be more culturally relevant in presenting the gospel. Well, what were McGavran's ideas? First of all, he thought that the focus of evangelism should be on people groups. In other words, not on individuals, so less individualistic. He also stressed the importance of using Indigenous missionaries to reach their own people. And thirdly, he felt it was important to be culturally relevant. In In other words, there was a need to contextualize the gospel. Contextualization in mission or evangelism was to take into account the language, customs, values, and worldview of different people groups to ensure the message was understandable and relatable. A specific example of this can be found in Don Richardson's book, Peace Child. And in the following video, he explains how he and his wife and young son went to the area of New Guinea in the early 1960s to begin mission work amongst the Sawi people.
Don, thank you so much for sparing time.
My pleasure, Alan.
You went in 1962 to Irian Jaya to live among the Sawi people. You, your wife, and your 7-month-old
baby son, Stephen.
Yes. That's quite a commitment.
It was indeed. It was like God was whispering to me saying, I want you to go there. They're the people I've prepared for you to bear witness among. I know they're cannibals. I know they're hedonists. Don't worry about that. I've taken care of everything. So we went there. I went in among them, and it turned out for a couple of years they'd begun to hear, in their extreme isolation, scattered reports about tall, pale, sickly-looking beings called Tuans. That means European types, because they're all black-skinned. They're like the separated cousins of the sub-Saharan black race. And all the reports about Tuans were so glowing, positive. Wherever Tuans go, they're being obat, medicine, garam, salt, steel tools, nylon fish line, fish hooks, razor blades. From their point of view, this was all amazing technology. So they were saying, we think we'd like to welcome a Tuan, and asking other tribes, are there any spare Tuans around? Only to have the other tribes say nastily, a Tuan live among you. Who do you think you are? You Sawi, you're the worst of all the tribes. Don't get your hopes up. You'll never be favored by one of these rare, amazing beings. So the Sawi were saying wistfully, perhaps they're right, perhaps we'll never be favored, but they also said, just in case, someday, somewhere, there's a Tuan who finds out that we live here. If he decides he wants to come and live among us and does not allow the anti-Sawi propaganda of our enemies to turn him away from us, we find out that Tuan has chosen us. We will let him know in no uncertain terms we choose him. He'll be our Tuan, we'll be his tribe. Well, Alan, I'm a Tuan. My wife, Carol, a Nyonya, a female Tuan. We even had a little baby Tuan, little Stephen. When I went in among them to test their attitudes, leaving Carol and Stephen in a safe place, they found out I was one of these rare beings they'd been hearing about. I used sign language indicating I wanted their help to build a house. They got the message. They began shouting for joy. And they worked like bees in the hive, helping me build a little 7-meter by 7-meter thatch roofed house. And when it was finished, I said, still using sign language, I'm going now to fetch my wife and son. I'll return with them in 3 days' time to reside among you in this little house you've so kindly helped me build. We came back 3 days later. 400 of them were massed on the riverbank, waiting to see if I would keep my promise and return with my family. We got closer and saw all the men had war paint on. They were holding weapons. Was this a welcoming party or something else? Were we being invited to dinner or
As dinner?
to be dinner? Too late to think of retreating. We went up onto the shore in the midst of that armed host. They closed in all around us so tightly we could hardly move. Their eyes were gleaming with excitement, but they were apparently waiting for a signal. And sure enough, someone shouted a signal, Asa! And at that, they began shouting for joy, pounding on their drums, and danced around us, escorting us away from the river up to the front steps of the little thatch box. Took us several minutes to get there. Then they grew quiet, motioning to us to climb the steps because it was built up above the ground because of monsoon flooding. We went inside. When I closed the door behind us, they began pounding on their drums again, danced around us all night. All the next day, all the second night, all the second day, even all the third night. We were welcomed royally. They carried the weapons and wore the war paint in much the same way that a military honor guard in our culture wears military uniforms and holds bayonets, welcoming a special guest.
Because the funny thing about their culture is that it's completely unlike ours.
Yes, that's true.
It's a culture of treachery in that the heroes of their stories are the guys who do the bad things.
When I learned the language well enough to tell them about Judas betraying Jesus with a kiss of all things, that tickled them. They began acclaiming Judas as a special kind of Tare Duan, a master of treachery. They said, tell us more about Judas. He's our kind of guy. He's the sort of man any one of us would be proud to promise a daughter to in marriage. Believe me, that was not the response I was expecting. I sat among them praying, help, Lord, help. I need a gift of wisdom. These people honor treachery as a virtue. They think Judas as the hero, Jesus as the dupe to be laughed at. And warfare broke out to make things darker at that moment. 2 of 3 villages that we welcomed because they wanted to come out of the deep jungle, live in the open by the river, in proximity to the Tuan and the Nyonya. It was great to have that many people living close. We thought we'd have 1 village, but 3 came. And 2 of them were not able to restrain their memories of previous violence. And they were fighting each other right around our home. And then when I learned about their idealization of treachery, their honoring of masters of treachery as heroes, I thought, I think God has placed us in the midst of a culture that is devoid of any mechanism for making peace. I was wrong. It was possible in a context of idealized treachery only if a father in 1 of 2 warring villages was willing to establish a basis for mutual trust by making a sacrifice so great that everyone in both villages would know he had to take one of his own children, give his child away as a peace child, to be raised by a family in the enemy village. And if that child remained alive in the other village, the peace was secure. No one would be so evil as to invalidate a sacrifice as great as that by renewing hostility after.
Don Richardson later gathered accounts of how God enabled the people of different pagan cultures to understand the meaning of the gospel by preparing them, as it were, through cultural practices and stories. Now, what was the ultimate outcome of Don Richardson and the Peace Child story? Well, here he is talking about the Tsawi people 50 years later.
You call these now cultural compasses.
That's right.
Redemptive analogies that Eternity in Our Hearts says is in every culture.
I went on to find examples of these things around the world.
You've got to
Library
look for it.
research, yes.
And these offer that entryway for the gospel.
That's right.
In this case, the divine peace child who brings reconciliation to all men, the barriers coming down. That tribe today, well, 5 tribes would greet you in the
Yes.
peace we're about to see now.
Because with the help of John and Esther Mills, other Canadians, we evangelized the Sawi, completed the translation of the New Testament, taught them to read it, also taught them to read the national language of the nation that they didn't even know they were citizens of. So they used the national language after we left to reach out to 4 other tribes.
So these former cannibals, headhunters, are evangelists for Jesus
Yes,
Christ today.
yes.
I mean, pinch yourself as you watch this moving slice from Never the Same.
Normally you wouldn't hear someone say, it's great to see so many old people. Disease took its toll. Death from warfare took its toll. But now to come back and see that there are just throngs among the crowds of people, throngs of people with gray hair and old enough that they have trouble walking along the trail, that's a special joy.
So they've reached out and they've invited, I think, 5 tribes around them. So they're making themselves a base because something really significant happened among them. And it seems like this has been implanted in the hearts of the Sawi, that they aren't meant to just sit around enjoying Christ and getting fat and happy. The whole point is to reach out and share it with others. So they're doing that. We're seeing it in action.
He's explaining he's from a remote village, and after the Bible was translated, someone brought the scriptures to him, and he believed. Isaac. He's taken a Christian name called Isaac. They really rolled out the red carpet. Hundreds and hundreds of people from 5 different tribes were here. And for me, the emotion was just overwhelming. I think one of the things that struck me maybe the most was how many people grabbed my hand or gave me a hug, often with tears in their eyes, and said that they had been my close friend or playmate when I was little. And I was surprised how many of the older people are still alive who actually witnessed my parents' arrival. So it's amazing to see the legacy of God's grace through my parents in their obedient step of faith 50 years ago.
So McGavran was one of the initiators of what has been called the church growth movement. Now, critics have accused the movement of only promoting a pragmatic, mechanical approach to mission and evangelism, and that they were only concerned with statistics instead of souls. And further, they emphasised cultural differences to the detriment of Christian unity. One of these critics was David Wells, who said, "A new and more culturally adapted evangelicalism emerged, the central figures of which were no longer the scholars who'd been prominent in the immediate post-war years, but rather a host of managers, planners and bureaucrats, and not far behind them, marketeers. This new set of leaders view growing a church, or for that matter any Christian ministry, as essentially no different from growing a business." One of those who was accused of relying on marketing techniques for growing his church was Robert Schuler. Now, Schuler had been influenced by the writings of Norman Vincent Peale. Now, Peale, in 1952, had written his widely influential book, The Power of Positive Thinking. And Robert Schuler took it further, and he talked about positive faith and his own possibility thinking. Now, Peale was a fellow Reformed Church minister and a friend of Schuler. In 1955, Schuler's denomination sent him to Orange County in California to establish a new church there. He was only 28 at the time, and he rented a drive-in theatre for Sunday morning worship. A congregation in cars slowly grew until, in the second year, they could afford to build a small chapel. Early on in his ministry, Schuler went door to door, inviting people to attend his church. And significantly, he asked them what type of church that they would like to attend. Now, according to his friend, Michael Nason, to his surprise, he found that most people didn't even know the difference between the Old and New Testaments and couldn't care less. That's when he realised that giving Bible studies on Sunday morning during a worship service would turn off most of the unchurched people entirely. Then he asked the people what sort of church they would want to attend. They wanted light, beauty, tranquility, beautiful music, friendly people, programs that suited their needs, sermons that weren't boring, better yet, sermons that weren't even sermons. They wanted a place where they could feel comfortable. He decided at that point that he would never again use his pulpit as a teaching platform. Schuler began to see his church as a mission, a place where non-Christians would feel comfortable enough to come in and then later accept Jesus. His preaching content changed as a result, and he focused only on positive things. By 1970, he began what became the most widely watched televised church service in the United States called the Hour of Power. And in 1980, his famous Crystal Cathedral was officially opened. From humble beginnings with 50 cars in a drive-in theatre, his church had grown to 10,000 members, and he was reaching a televised audience of millions. Schuler's influence was widespread, but he also had his critics, and he was referred to as the evangelist without a gospel. His often unorthodox messages were labelled as pseudo-Christian, and his church was accused of focusing on fulfilling what people would want and where they were comfortable. It was consumerist and self-gratifying, his critics argued. His aim has been to positivise the Christian message, and his attitudes are seen in the following quotes. He said, "The purpose of religion is not to say, I have all the answers and my job is to convert you. That road leads to the Twin Towers. That attitude is an invitation to extremists. The emphasis should move from proselytising to just trying to help everybody who had hurts and hopes." Another who tried to make the Christian message more relevant or to contextualise it to his audience was Bill Hybels. He was pastor of Willow Creek, Illinois, which had at its peak an attendance of about 17,000 people. He began what was called the seeker-friendly church movement. This was Hybels' solution to reach the unreached. He said, "Program our Sunday morning service to non-believers and program our service to believers on another day or evening, so that the newcomers would feel welcome, unthreatened, and entertained. It is absolutely essential that the unchurched Harrys and Marys be introduced to a creative, introductory level, positive, Bible-centred church experience on a Sunday morning, a place designed for the unbelievers. We've put a lot of time and thought into what non-church people want from a Sunday morning service, and we have concluded that they basically want four things: anonymity, truth presented at an introductory level, time to make a decision, and excellence in programming, creativity, humour, contemporary worship, relevancy, etc." At Willow Creek, they developed specialised ministries, such as programs for 4 age divisions of youth, 3 categories of single adults, married couples, divorced persons, single parents, and physically and mentally challenged individuals, as well as outreach services to the homeless, the poor, and prison inmates. In evaluating this idea, G.A. Pritchard said that Hybels incorporates large chunks of the American psychological worldview into his basic teaching and teaches that fulfillment is a consequence of the Christian life. There is a lack of critical evaluation to Willow Creek's approach to relevance. This felt need approach to relevance ultimately distorts their Christianity. Lee Strobel, who is the former teaching pastor at Willow Creek and then left to go to Saddleback, said, "Objections to the market-driven church generally relate to the method that's used to communicate the gospel, not the message itself. And consequently, we're free to use the God-given creativity to present Christ's message in new ways that our target audience will connect with." In October 2007, Willow Creek released results of a study on the effectiveness of their programs and philosophy of ministry. Amazingly, the results of the study led Hybels to a complete turnaround in his thinking regarding his seeker-friendly approach. "We made a mistake. What we should have done when people cross the line of faith and become Christians, we should have started telling people and teaching people that they have to take responsibility to become self-feeders. We should have taught people how to read their Bible between services and how to do the spiritual practices much more aggressively on their own. Osteen is another who's had enormous influence in the US. He's pastored the largest church in the United States, Lakewood, which is located in Houston, Texas. It has an auditorium seating nearly 17,000 people, and there are 7 weekly services with an attendance of more than 45,000. He's also authored a number of very successful books and has had a successful television ministry. Osteen's book, Your Best Life Now, 7 Steps to Living at Your Full Potential, reached the top 10 of best-selling books in the US in 2006. Well, what were Osteen's 7 steps? He said that people should enlarge their vision. They should develop a healthy self-image. They should discover the power of their thoughts and words. They should let go of the past, find strength through adversity, live to give, and choose to be happy. In October 2007, he published Become a Better You, 7 Keys to Improving Your Life Every Day. This book has also topped the New York Times bestsellers list. According to one reviewer, at the heart of the Osteen's message is that achieving a successful, prosperous life of fulfillment can only occur when we stop worrying about the past or future to make the most of each present moment by using our God-given strengths and talents to achieve our goals. Osteen has also been influenced by this marketing approach to ministry. He said, "To be a success in marketing, you have to know where people itch and scratch it, or you have to create a desire in them by creating a hunger for something they currently do not have, nor formerly knew they needed. All commercials can be condensed down to one of these 2 truths." Osteen has also been criticised for preaching a prosperity message. He has said, "I think God wants us to be prosperous. I think He wants us to be happy. To me, you need to have money to pay your bills. I think God wants us to send our kids to college. I think He wants us to be a blessing to other people. But I don't think I'd say God wants us to be rich. It's all relative, isn't it?" Rick Warren is well known for his 40 Days of Purpose books. His material has been used by churches throughout the world. He's been the pastor at Saddleback Church in Los Angeles in Southern California, and like Schuler and Hybels, he took a marketing approach to establishing his church in 1980. For example, he chose the location after researching which areas were the fastest growing in the US. Before even starting the church in that area, he worked on researching the demographic, establishing the type of church that people wanted. And today, Saddleback is one of the largest churches in the US. Warren founded the Purpose-Driven Network, which is a global movement of churches in 162 countries, which promotes and uses his ideas and material. And it's claimed that over 400,000 ministers and priests have been trained worldwide in his theology and practical methods. His goals are expressed in his book, The Purpose-Driven Church. He wrote, "Every church needs to grow warmer through fellowship, deeper through discipleship, stronger through worship, broader through ministry, and larger through evangelism." In 2005, Warren was asked by the Rwandan president, Paul Kagame, to help his country become a purpose-driven nation. In order to implement this, Warren enlisted thousands of Saddleback Church members who went to Rwanda in small groups to initiate a national strategy with the cooperation of 600 Rwandan churches. Business leaders and members of parliament in Rwanda have also become involved. In order to get an idea of how a megachurch operates, I'll use the example of Saddleback. Now, the Saddleback Auditorium is small by American standards, seating around 3,500 people, but their combined weekly attendance at their various services is around 25,000. In addition to the main sanctuary, there are a number of other very large buildings at their Los Angeles site. Its children's centre seats about 450 on its own. The refinery was built for the purpose of student ministry. This building includes dining and kitchen facilities, a theatre, game rooms, an 800-seat auditorium, a full-court basketball gymnasium, a half-court practice area, 3 classrooms, and a multi-purpose room for recreation and business meetings. More than 2,500 young people attend services in this facility each week. The Saddleback is also very strong in focusing on the importance of small groups, and it encourages all members to be involved in its various activities. And there are about 2,500 small groups at Saddleback. Critics have argued that much of the approach of church leaders such as Schuler, Hybels and Osteen has been influenced by what is termed postmodernism. In addition, it's said that they have taken a marketing approach to promoting the gospel. Well, what is postmodernism? Briefly explained, postmodern thought is that there is no universal truths and that everyone has total freedom to create his or her own truth. Postmoderns are driven by the heart rather than the head. Now, how's this impacted the church? Well, some evangelical leaders do not see the same need as previously to think through their apologetics. The church is tempted to present an audience-driven, user-friendly gospel in order to compete with the many other spiritualities available in our society. We'll conclude this video on events and movements by looking at other changes that have been taking place over this time, in particular with respect to changes in worship practices and worship places. One of the changes was in the area of music, both in terms of the songs that were sung, but also in the instruments that were introduced over this time. These changes largely began in the mid-1960s. Now, I'm not going to go into detail in this video, but if you're interested, I've put together a video series on the history of contemporary Christian music, and this is available on YouTube. Now, here are just some of the changes that have taken place in worship since the 1960s. Chorus books were added. Then eventually they replaced the hymn books. Then chorus books were replaced by overhead projectors and projector screens installed. Eventually overheads were replaced by data projectors. Hard wooden pews were replaced by stackable chairs. And sanctuaries became multi-purpose rooms. The orientation of the worshippers was altered to face long ways within the building. Some churches experimented with what was called church in the round, with the preacher at the centre. With the inclusion of drums, guitars and voices needed to be amplified, so sound systems were installed and the ubiquitous sound desk placed at the rear of the church. Theatre lighting and in some cases smoke machines were introduced. Building styles also changed. They became minimalistic with little or no windows or natural light. Interiors became plain with little decoration. Often there was not even a cross to show that it was used as a place for Christian worship. We've now come to the end of examining some of the many significant events and movements that have taken place in relatively recent times. In our next and final video in the series, we'll examine the state of the Christian faith today.